All right. Sorry for the delay. Let's go ahead and get started on chapter two, which is investigating system requirements. This is kind of where we're gathering all of the data and metrics needed for the project. Um, Again, here's our overriding theme we'll see a lot during the semester, which is these iterations and core processes that we'll be focusing on during each iteration. Previous chapter we covered, which was chapter 11, got into the first two, which really are both project management questions. Um, we were considering how do we get approval for the project, how do we sell it, how do we write this vision document and list the benefits to doing the system. How do we plan it out? We talked about these scheduling programs like Microsoft Project, where you could do Gantt charts, and doing the cost benefit analysis. All of that stuff would go into planning and monitoring, which are really heavily focused on in the first couple of iterations. So it's during the second iteration and into the third iteration that you'd really be moving more towards the so-called discovery and understanding. How do I find out what I need to do for the project? So there's kind of two broad categories for these requirements that I'll be gathering. The obvious one, in my opinion, would be the functional requirements, which are really what the system does, like very explicitly what am I going to be designing and coding for. I've talked a lot in prior classes about business use and business requirements and what do people actually do when trying to model that. I've kind of hammered home the concept of an information system as a social system that's been technically implemented. What a lot of that is referring to are these functional requirements. What should the system do? But there are this other broad category of non-functional requirements, and these are important because not understanding the so-called non-functional requirements can impede you and have that greater likelihood of failure that we referred to during chapter 11. What types of constraints do I have? So understanding the limitations of the people that I have that develop it and the limitations I have of the technology, and how quickly should it run and what should the response time be. So these are all, they're important, but they're not literally what does the system do. And we'll get into some detail with that as we go on. So when you're determining requirements, really the requirements are based on the end users. And so understanding them, via their participation in this process is probably one of the core tenets here. Also understanding what type of so-called technical implementation that you're doing. There's three very broad descriptions of that. One is I'm automating the business process. So let's look at an example here. So if I run a warehouse, and in that warehouse I have a process by which when new shipments come in, the person that runs the warehouse has a notepad and they write down the contents of the shipment, and then they put that in a filing cabinet. And you might say, okay, this process of tracking incoming shipments to the warehouse can be automated by perhaps having them with a tablet, either an iPad or an Android tablet, and they can just write in with their finger or type in, theoretically, what the contents are, and it'll be automatically stored in a centralized database. So you're not really changing the process that much, you're more automating it. Another one might be business process improvement. So going back to the same example with the warehouse, instead of saying, well, this manual process, might it not be better if we instead start including RFIDs, radio frequency identification. These are these kind of tags. It's a little bit like the Easy Pass you can buy for your car. That's a RFID. But you get a small RFID in each shipment container, and as it passes through the entry to the warehouse, it automatically gets sent in. So, but in a way, we're improving it because we're not relying on this user to enter the information where you could have some errors, and it's time consuming as well to stop the movement of the product in and have them entering the data, whether it be by hand the original way or even the BPA, the business process automation. And then finally, there's business process reengineering, where you might completely reimagine how you do the business. You might say, well, how much money is the warehouse costing us? This is a situation where we're paying to store stuff. Maybe we should move into a new way of doing things, like JIT, or have a line where when something comes in, it doesn't go into the warehouse, it moves directly to where we're selling it to. So we're almost, in effect, removing the warehouse from the entire equation. So that would be re-engineering the entire process. And all of these are essentially new systems, but they have very different ways in which you are going to be doing this process. Obviously, from a small amount of time with BPA to a large amount of time with BPR, because it's a re-engineering of the entire process. So as you're doing this, there's kind of two phases that you have to be considering for these requirements that you're gathering. One is there's the way things are done now, and you have to understand that fully. You have to understand, okay, the guy or girl writes down the stuff as they come in. I want to know that exact process, exactly how it runs. What's the frequency of the shipments coming in? How long does it take them to do that? Are there any errors? You have to really understand that. Then you need to think about, well, how can it be made better? So kind of off the top of my head, when I was describing this, I gave some potential methods by which you could improve this as-is system, this process as it runs. And then finally, based on your decision for investment, what perhaps you've been approved for with time and money, then you start developing this concept for what the system will be. And again, I've already addressed the BPA, BPI, and BPR, the small change, the moderate change, and the significant change, depending on how you're moving away from the as-is system into the to-be system. All right. So what do we do? What exactly are you doing during this phase? We've talked about a lot of the planning stuff that you do in the prior two phases. In this phase, the primary thing you're thinking about is gathering the detailed information. Primarily, from what I've seen in the field, most of the methods revolve around interviews. I'd say that's the primary data collection method. There are also questionnaires. So you might be wondering, well, those two seem very similar. Why are they distinct things, interviews and questionnaires? They're different in some important ways, but the primary difference would be scope and scale. So for interviews, given that they're very time consuming, there's only so many you can do. You can go very deep with them, but not broad. Versus questionnaires, you can go very broad, not necessarily deep, because people don't spend hours and hours on questionnaires, or they're going to be shallow, but you can hit everybody in the organization. So that's the primary difference between the two, deep and not broad versus broad and not deep. Document analysis, going back to the warehouse example, literally looking at what the person writes down for the shipments that come in. That's a document analysis as to what they do. Going through the filing cabinet and seeing how it's organized, seeing what their plan was for, if you're writing it down for a reason, and the reason is record keeping, and generally with records they're going to be referred to, are they used for a quarterly analysis or for an end of year report, or if something goes missing, like what exactly is going on with these documents, so you could figure out that with a document review. Watching people, just literally sitting down all day and watching how they do their work. Talking to the vendors, and again, back to the warehouse example, the truck drivers, the people that they're selling or buying from or selling to, and or just hanging out and just not in any formal way, but just whatever comments or suggestions that you have. So once you're gathering all of this, then you have to define them. Um, I read the text, and I'm not sure if you guys have had a chance to read this chapter, but you might notice that if you have read it, there are portions that I have not included in the presentation of the chapter, and a lot of those are this point here, this modeling functional requirements and non-functional requirements. I felt that that was confusing and misleading, particularly for people that haven't done this before and are just learning this entire process. Most of the time, my construct or my understanding of the construct of what we're doing here is gathering information and formalizing it. And if you're modeling, generally that's more on the design side. So they kind of had these ad hoc models that the text was going on and on about. It was kind of ways to graphically display in a somewhat formal way the information that you've gathered. And to me, there's this weird overlap between that and formally modeling it during design, and I thought it was inappropriate. So not only am I not including it during the lecture, but when you guys take the test, which I think is next week, let me double check. Here we go. Yeah, so the test is a week from today. I'm not going to ask you about the requirements gathering modeling. I really don't think that's an appropriate area. I think it's almost to the point of misleading. So while you can do it, oftentimes when you guys are just communicating, not even, hardcore IS stuff like this, but just talking to your friends and you're trying to describe a concept that they just don't seem to be getting, you might, hold on, I have a question. You might draw out your concept, and that's kind of what the modeling is. So let's see what this question is. Will you do any test review between now and next week? It's a good question, and the answer is yes. On Thursday, I plan to just do a quick overview of the things that you might expect to see on test one. So that'll be part of our Thursday duties. Yep, no problem. Okay. So moving past the defining into prioritizing, with prioritizing requirements, again, you often have to make choices here. You have to decide what is something that you can't do without when it comes to this new project. That would be essential. What would be something that is important but not absolutely essential? And then finally, we don't have to have it, but if we can, we drop those in that category. And you make your decisions as to what you're going to focus on during your various iterations based on this breakdown. Develop your user interface dialogues. What might the end system ultimately look like to the user? And then finally, evaluate your requirements with the users. So this is where you've drawn out some concepts, you've written your use cases, you've developed these user interface dialogues, and then you go back to the user and you say, so what do you think? Is this something that would work for you? And getting that feedback is important because oftentimes your interpretation is going to be different than their interpretation. So here, the text has this acronym, FERPS Plus, which just stands for defining your various requirements. What are my functional requirements? How should it be used? How reliable does it need to be? How quick does it need to run? This is your performance requirements. How secure should it be? These are your security requirements. And then there are others as well. And this goes back to that first slide where we talked about the major grouping of functional and non-functional. And the functional is self-explanatory, where this is what the system should do. What are the business rules that I'm modeling here? Those are your functional requirements. The non-functional requirements, this is where you group in the other part of the FERPS acronym. So function is one, And then that non-functional group includes the questions of user interface, how easy should it be to use? And you might say, well, as easy as possible, and that's true, but there could be a trade-off as well. Like some ease of use might actually be incompatible with the amount of time you have to work on it. So you have to kind of make these trade-offs. An acceptable failure rate, again, you guys might look at that and say that's kind of a dumb requirement because the failure rate should always be 0. It should always work utterly and completely. Well, oftentimes that's not a possibility. You can't get to that perfect system. So what is an acceptable failure rate? And again, a cost benefit is going to drive that. What are our recovery methods? What if we have a ransomware attack? Ransomware attacks are happening all the time where people encrypt the database and then say you have to pay us money in order to be able to use it again. Well, is there a way around that? What if they do destroy the data? Do we have a way to recover it? Response time. Now, most systems today are network systems, so this can get extremely complicated because you have all sorts of failure points along the way. It could be the network itself, it could be the person's connection to their ISP, it could be their own computer, it could be their own application not running right, it could be your servers. So there's all sorts of things that go into response time. On the security side, you might be thinking about, okay, how do we make sure that the right people are getting where they need to go, and what's our rules for encryption? Again, cost benefit here. Ideally, you'd say, well, we'll encrypt everything. That's pretty intensive on the computational side. Encrypting everything that's going to be stored in a database, well, that means it has to be decrypted anytime it's accessed, which is a computational cycle. And if you have millions of operations that are going on, that you're adding to the computational cycle, not to mention if you're using intensive encryption techniques. But these are all things you need to consider, and none of those, from the user interface to the recovery methods to the response time, none of those have anything to do with the actual system itself. They're all stuff around the system, but they're still important to consider. Remember, it was FERPS plus, so the plus are the other things as well, other non-functional things, which might include say, for example, there's a standard in the organization that everybody has to use Windows running, we'll say Windows 7, and there's a specific list of hardware that you're allowed to buy. Well, that's a restriction. This is going to limit what we can do in the organization. What about my staff has an understanding of certain languages and tools, and my requirements say, let me give you an example. They're all used to writing standalone applications. That's just what they're used to doing. So they're used to writing applications that will run locally on the machine. Maybe Java is a language that they're comfortable with, and that's what they do. And for the new system, you're saying, well, this is going to be a network system, so they have to understand server-side scripts and client-side scripts. Well, can we do that? So this is something you need to consider. Do we need to do training or hire new people or outsource? That's going to affect the way you do the actual build. Are there existing subsystems that you have to connect to? And in HCI, which stands for Human Computer Interface, the most important thing by far is consistency. It always should be something familiar to the user. So you might have a limitation on, okay, we have this existing system with its own interface. I have to match that to link from a consistency perspective. It's something else to consider as well. The physical facilities and equipment constraints is something else to think about. And then finally, after it's all done and it's running, how do I ensure that any patches get deployed out to the people appropriately, the people that are using the systems in a distributed way? Are they automatic? Do they have to prove it? Are there going to be issues with things breaking if not everybody does that? So that supportability is an important aspect. So who do you talk to? Who are the people that you're going to be getting this data from, getting the information from? Well, anyone that has an interest in this system, in the successful implementation of the system, would be a stakeholder. And these are people that you'd want to talk to. So you have people inside the organization. So these would be our internal stakeholders, the people that are most intimately involved with it. You may also have external stakeholders. Going back to the warehouse example, let's say I were to do a BPI, a business process improvement. If you recall, what I suggested for that was perhaps the use of RFID on all the shipments. So if I'm using RFID on all of the shipments and they have to come in that way, now I have to deal with an external stakeholder that has to work with me to make sure that that process is going to rigorously be carried out on their end. I can supply the RFID, but they have to make sure that they're on all of the shipments as they come in. So that's somebody that I'm going to need to involve with the build of the system and talk to them and make sure they understand this is the new contractual obligation that they have with me. And we have operational stakeholders. So these are people who regularly interact with the system on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, executive stakeholders. They don't interact, but they have a financial interest. So this might be the people, approving the money and the purse strings and all of that. So what techniques? I touched on this in a prior slide, and I mentioned interviewing being one of the key aspects for information gathering. There's also questionnaires. There's reviewing the documentation, observing the business procedures and documenting that, researching vendor solutions. Is there already a solution out there? Am I reinventing the wheel here? And then getting user comments and suggestions. So when I'm interviewing, I'd want to get my questions ready ahead of time, and then decide, what is my process for the actual interviews themselves? Am I going to be meeting individually with people or with groups of users? Let me pause and address the project that you'll be working on in this class. And I'm not talking about these little mini projects that you've been working on, but the bigger project you'll be doing. So as I mentioned in the first class, this is different because of coronavirus and having you guys go out to organizations to meet. I don't think that's really appropriate this semester. So what we're going to be doing here is I'm going to be your client, and unfortunately that is going to make it too simple for you, but you probably say fortunately, I say unfortunately, but a lot of these are going to be already decided. Clearly, if I'm the only client, your interviews are going to be individual, and you won't have the opportunity to do some of the other things like observation and questionnaires, but we got to make do with what the reality is giving us now. All right, and going back to this. So you would actually go through and get your questions answered. You document that, you write them down. One thing to consider with this is recording. Generally, it is advisable to consider recording the interviews so you can go back and see if you missed things. This can get a little dicey, particularly when we're dealing with external stakeholders. Oftentimes they're uncomfortable with that. I'm sure you guys have seen the YouTube videos of confrontations, people that don't like to wear masks, or political events, and you'll have someone recording and they'll say, "You don't have my permission to record, I'm going to call the cops." People have this, they kind of push back on it. They feel uncomfortable with things being recorded. So that's something that you need to consider with the external stakeholders. Also at the end, you need to consider, are there going to be future meetings? Do I need to follow up with missing information or going more in depth into something that was brought up during the interview? So 3 broad types of questions. closed-ended, open-ended, and probing. The closed-ended are going to be real quick, with very little interpretation. They give the example of how many telephone orders are received per day. They're just going to give you a number. And the reason why it's important to ask that for multiple people is you might get different answers. And that's going to incur follow-ups or a deeper analysis as to why you might get different answers. But they're going to be pretty discrete answers. Open-ended, this is more where you're asking their perception or interpretation of things. What do you think about the way invoices are currently processed? What are some problems you face on a daily basis? Things like this. And really, the best information you're going to get for moving to the so-called 2B system will be with the open-ended questions. And then finally, there's the probing questions. These are generally follow-ups. So they'll give you an answer to something, and then you'll ask them for justification. Well, why do you say that? Well, why do you think that's the case? Or give me an example of this thing you're describing. But the real value is definitely with the open-ended questions. So when do you ask what? In this previous slide, we looked at different types of questions, and you might be wondering, do I ask all of these at once, or do I ask them at different times? And I think we just had a question pop up. How many questions are usually asked in an interview? That is an excellent question. You can't plan to have people all day. You can't say, I got you for 6 hours, I'm just going to grill you. People tend to start to lose focus and lose interest, and not only that, but you're taking them away from their real job. So generally, you'd want to limit yourself to at most 45 minutes to an hour for the actual process of an interview. And in terms of how many questions you would ask, a lot of that would depend on this slide here. Talks about the different focus during the different cycles of interviewing. So early on, you might do this unstructured interview. So with an unstructured interview, you're asking more of the open-ended questions. You're trying to get a broad feel for how people do their work. And when you're doing these unstructured interviews, generally you're going to be asking fewer questions because there's a lot of open-ended questions, and a lot of probing questions. So I would say you'd usually plan for somewhere between 7 and 12 questions during that stage, during the unstructured interview. But you're not going to force that through. You're not going to say, okay, I've written out 9 questions. We're going to get to the 9 questions, and that's that. If you're still talking about question 4 by the time your time runs up, then that's it. You might do a follow-up later, but for that particular interview session, you're going to close it and move on to the next person, or make plans for the next interview. So the structured interviews, this is where we're getting really specific, more closed-ended questions. You'd want to do that later. And the reason why is the right questions to ask. You may not necessarily know the really specific questions to ask early in the process. So you're going to get that information during the unstructured interviews, and then you're going to be able to plan out some much better questions. And in terms of the number for this, because there's not as much to talk about per question, you're going to be asking a lot more. So you might get through 40 or 50 questions during a structured interview session. And oftentimes, I would say, in my experience, that the unstructured interviews are quite common early on, but since you want to get a broader representation, usually there aren't as many structured interview sessions. Most of the time that converts into more of a questionnaire type of thing, because if my question is, how many orders come in per day, I don't need to ask someone to their face, necessarily, that question. If there are 75 people involved with the orders that are coming in, I'd want to know from all of them. And it would be a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? Time efficient or effective to send that out in a questionnaire. So I would say that it's less common to have a lot of structured interviews. Some more examples for general overall themes. If the theme is trying to figure out the business operation, You ask, what do you do? People love to talk about themselves. So you say, well, what do you do here? How these operations are performed, you might follow that. So again, these are the more unstructured side. Well, how exactly do you do this? And what steps do you follow? And how could they be done differently? And then finally, a theme of what information is needed. Because again, with most information systems, it really boils down to information, the data itself. So what information do you use? What inputs do you use? What outputs do you produce? These are types of questions you might ask for that. So preparing for the interview. You should have an overriding objective for any given interview. You should plan ahead. What is my goal in doing this? What am I trying to figure out? Analyze all of the potential people and which ones would be the most effective for whatever phase you're on of the interview. Determine the project team members to participate, so you make that determination. Build a list of questions and issues to be discussed. Review the related documents and materials, set the time and location, and then let everyone know they're on the same page. Obviously, this is easy today with calendar apps like Google Calendar. You can send the invitation out, let them know exactly where it's going to be, if it's going to be virtual or face-to-face, and then go from there. During the interview, obviously arrive on time. Don't make the person wait. That's insulting. Look for exception and error conditions. So if you see things that don't make sense that they're describing, be aware of that. Make sure to push back and not in an aggressive way, but just in a thorough way so that you have all the information. Probe for details. See if they can give up as much information as possible. Take thorough notes and identify and document unanswered items or open questions. I noticed the text didn't really go into the recording question, and that's really a decision that you'd have to make in conjunction with the interviewee if they're okay with that. When you're done, you've finished the interview, you want to debrief, go over everything, make sure that it's complete, it looks correct, and that you understand it. And this is, I had a little bit of, I didn't really agree with the text going into building these kind of ad hoc models. It says build the models. I don't know. I don't think so. Identify the areas needing further clarification. This would be for your follow-up interviews. Make sure you shoot a email out, or if you see them, thank them for their participation. And if there are unanswered questions, just follow up. Oftentimes the follow-up can be asynchronous. So it doesn't necessarily mean sit down with them again. You can just send an email and they'll get back to you whenever they're ready to follow up on unanswered questions. So that's one method, and that's the big one. The interviewing is a major method of data gathering. Another method is the questionnaire. So the questionnaire, this is when you've gathered sufficient information to get a good understanding via the interviews, and you have these really specific questions that you want a broad range of response from. So you'd write them out and you'd send them to a large number of people. You can send them via paper. To me, that's quaint. There are some people that love paper, and I don't understand that. I despise it. I think it's a complete waste to print things out. Speaking of which, on the test a week from today, again, I hate paper. So the test will be done electronically. So make sure you bring a laptop or a tablet or something when you come to class a week from today, because it'll be an in-class test and it'll be done electronically. So make sure you bring that. So a little side note. Anyway, continue with questionnaires. You can do, I don't know if you guys have taken statistics or not, but there's random sampling that supposedly will give you a statistically generalizable response depending on the response rate. So in order to minimize costs and time, say your population, you might look at that and say, well, if the organization only has 100 people in it, why am I only doing a sample? Yes, that's a good question, but what if your organization has 50,000 people? it might be more time effective to say, okay, an appropriate. I'm having problems here. All right, there we go. An appropriate. I'm sorry, my screen keeps going black. Okay, an appropriate sample for 50,000 people might be 1,200. It's just going to be a lot more time effective to do that. Make sure the questions are clear and people don't have to interpret what they think you mean by it. And then you administer the questionnaire. Obviously, electronically would be much easier than sending out paper questions. And then you'd look at your response rate and see if it's going to still indicate a good generalizability and confidence interval and all of that. And then you'd have your report that you'd write as a follow-up. In terms of the design of the questionnaire itself, you want to kind of start with a hook. You want to get them interested in it and thinking this is something they want to do. So, to give you an example of a non-threatening or an interesting question, you could have a Likert scale question. So Likert scales are the 1 through 5 or 1 through 7. And it could be improving this company's standing in the industry is important to me. 1, disagree, or strongly disagree, and 5, strongly agree. That could be seen as a hook because it's like, well, how invested am I in the success of the company? My personal interest is I like money and I like making money, and this company continuing to thrive is going to help me do that. So it is important to me. Or you might have a more cynical person that says, no, it's not important because your question to me really means how much money can I make the stockholders, and it's not going to affect my salary at all. So, but it's still an interesting question to start with. You don't want to randomly just go all over the place with your questions. They should have a flow and groupings and modularity to it. And the most important questions you want to put at the top, because it's not uncommon with questionnaires for people to get a part of the way through and then say this is good enough and click submit. And it's more likely the questions aren't going to be answered if they're at the end. Don't crowd the page. Avoid abbreviations so people aren't guessing. Avoid bias or suggestive items or terms, or even questions themselves. Even the way I worded that so-called hook question, that could be seen as biased. For me to say, how important is the success of the organization? Well, it's almost like a leading question. Who would disagree with that? You could make that argument. Number the questions so they know where they are, and then you'd want to do a pre-test. Send it out to people involved in the process so that they might catch things that are confusing that you may not have known. And probably don't use identification with this, so people are more likely to respond. Here we have from the text an example of a questionnaire for the Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters. And you see a lot of these really specific questions at the top here. How many calls do you receive? How many phone calls are necessary to place an order? How many phone calls are for information about products? And so a person answering this, they're not going to have to necessarily think about this question. They're going to know, usually I get around 30 a day, or I get 45, and you'll get all those numbers that you can analyze based on all the questionnaire answers. And then down here we see these Likert scale questions. From strongly agree to strongly disagree. It would help me do my job better to have longer descriptions of products. So you'd make your analysis after the fact based on how many people said they strongly agree versus disagree with this. And then finally at the bottom we have more of an open-ended thing that kind of these qualitative questions that you can get answers to. Additional techniques. Observing and watching. Observing and documenting the business process. So this is where you're sitting and watching and just seeing if what they do matches what they've talked about in the interview, matches what you've seen in the questionnaires. Obviously, this is extremely time consuming, especially if you do it over a long term, because you're not having really any productivity. You're just sitting and watching. But it can be valuable. You can see, people always want to put their best face forward. And during an interview or even a questionnaire answer, they might really only answer 10 calls a day, but they want to appear more productive, so they say, well, I answer 30. It's kind of the self-reported symptom thing, how real is it? But the interesting thing is you have the same problem even observing. You guys may have heard of the Hawthorne effect, which is this psychological phenomenon where when people are being watched, they tend to work harder. And so you may still have some of those same effects, which means that it might be a good idea to instead use some type of camera, because people tend to forget that there's a camera there in workplaces, and then they'll eventually fall back to their normal way of doing their work. Whereas, they call it the white coat effect. If someone there watching, you're really going to want to put on a show versus some discreet camera in the corner. They may notice it initially, particularly if you tell them, I'm putting a camera in to gather data. But over time, it's going to fade into the background. So it's certainly something to consider, this Hawthorne effect. Researching vendor solutions. So we're probably not the first people to be involved, again, with a warehouse. We're not the first people to be involved here. What have other people done? Is there research out there that I can read that will inform how we might solve this problem? Have like a suggestion box. Just, no formal interview or questionnaire or observation or nothing like that. Just throw thoughts my way, to the end users. What exactly do you want out of this? What will make your job better? So that could be another way to gather information. All right. That went much quicker than expected. These online lectures, I will never get used to them. They're very odd. The time flow is never what I expect. Were there any questions on this topic on gathering requirements, or was it pretty straightforward?
Pretty straightforward.
Straightforward? All right. Very cool. Well, I think to describe it is straightforward. I think to go through it is actually probably the most difficult thing that you would do as a systems analyst. It is the most difficult thing because people are unpredictable and inconsistent. And this is the most people-oriented thing that you do in the whole process. A lot of the other stuff when we get into design, it's you analyzing data and you transforming data into formal models. That's something that the confusion is not there as much as, wow, well, I interviewed 75 people, 30 of them felt kind of over here, 30 of them felt over here, and then the remaining 15 were all over the place. What do I do with that? How do I model that? So there's a lot of going back and doing it over and over, and then you'll have the same person that was over here suddenly appear over here in the follow-up interview, and it is the most difficult thing to do. I've been involved in that several times, and I guess on the scale of system person to people person, I'm more so on the system side than the people side because my frustration level got very high dealing with them. I didn't really know how to move forward. I ended up just making my own decisions, which then when the system rolled out, there was people that were upset because it wasn't the thing they told me the first time as opposed to the second time. So I think you're right. I think you guys that responded and said it's pretty straightforward. I think you're right in understanding what to do. You guys have probably done interviews in other classes before. It's not like the first time you've ever done it. You understand what observations are. You understand what questionnaires are. You even have probably a little bit of an idea how you would design each of these things. But going through the process is the most difficult thing, for sure. For sure. All right, so I guess we'll end it a little early today. I would go over the test, but it's not complete. I want to have the test complete before I do that review, so we'll do that on Thursday. We also have a mini project which we'll be doing on Thursday, and I'll And then the first mini project will be graded by then. So if there's anything I need to go over with that, we can do that at that time as well. So I'll see you guys on Thursday, and let me know if you have any questions. See ya.